this video, we want to demonstrate how to install and configure a router. One of the first things that you need to do is purchase a router that meets your needs. Make sure that it has all of the features in the feature set that you want. The next thing that you're going to want to do is make sure that you have obtained the vendor documentation for that specific router so that you can configure it according to the vendor specification. So for instance here, I'm going to go ahead, I've already downloaded the vendor documentation for the router that we're going to configure here, so I am ready to go with that. Now the next thing that you have to do is you have to connect to some kind of configuration port. It could be a console port on the router. In this case, we're going to go ahead and the router that we're using here, we're going to connect to one of the LAN ports right here on the back of the router itself, and we're going to use that for our management, to connect to the management interface. Now that's the next part. The next step is connecting to the management interface. And again, if it's in a console port on a router, you'll probably see that you'll have a terminal of some sort open in front of you. In this case, what we're going to do is browse to the web administration page, check your vendor's documentation. A lot of times they default, in this case, 192.168.1.1, or you might see 192.168.0.1. It's important that, again, you go with the vendor supplied documentation. Now, once that's done, there's a couple of things that we have to do. One of the first things that we have to do is we have to change the defaults. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and disconnect or uncheck this contribute here. And rather than use the Linksys smart Wi-Fi setup, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a manual configuration, as you see down here. Now, keep in mind, and we do have to accept the end user license agreement, or the ULA, and then we can choose manual configuration. Now, remember that the interfaces will vary slightly. The steps that you perform, however, will be pretty much the same across the board. Like I said, the interface and the actual specifics to the vendor, they might differ slightly than from what you see here. So once we get logged into the interface, and you'll see it takes a second here because it's disabling the more user-friendly interface, and then it disconnects me and reconnects me into the interface that we can do the more advanced configuration. So we'll let it go ahead and get connected here, and then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and log in to this router. So let's go ahead and we will do that. And here we go. We've got our configuration page. Now, I'm not going to log in here. This is actually a cloud-based account, and again, specific to Linksys here. So what I want to do is I want to go into local access. Like I said, this could be different from the vendor that of the product that you're using currently. We're going to go ahead and we're going to enter our router, and in our documentation we see what the router's password is, the default password. In this case, the default password you'll see is going to be admin. Now, because not only do we know through the vendor documentation the router's password, so does everybody else who can obtain that documentation from the vendor website. That's the first thing that we're going to do, is change this router's password. So we'll go ahead and in this case, we're going to go to the connectivity setting. Notice that the router's password here, we're going to go ahead and edit this. And for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and use the super secret password that we've been using throughout our lab demo or lab environment. However, keep in mind that you're going to want to use a complex password. And then once that's done, we're going to go ahead and choose apply, and it's going to ask us if we want to change the router's password. We're going to go ahead and commit those changes to the router's configuration. Now, the next one is, it could be optional. You might have a way to do this in this router, because remote administration is done through their cloud-based platform. I don't see remote administration directly in this console, and we typically want to disable that. And we also want to make sure that we have secure local administration configuration channels. So that could be setting up SSH so that you can use something like PuTTY to console into the device and make sure that the session is encrypted so nobody can eavesdrop on it. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to change the administration side here. Notice that by default, HTTP is selected. Sometimes you can disable that. Sometimes you can disable HTTP and select HTTPS. In this case, we can't, but I'm also going to uncheck access via the wireless interface. And again, that is up to you and the specifications of your network. So we'll go ahead and we'll commit those changes. And now that we've secured the local administration channel, the next thing that we might want to do is configure some of the basic settings. For instance, some of the basic settings that you might see in here are, for instance, in your connectivity fields here, some of your internet settings are going to be configuring the WAN interface. And a lot of times by default, we might just have an automatic configuration. It might just be DHCP out to our internet service provider. However, depending on your specific needs, you might be doing something like the point-to-point protocol over Ethernet, PPPoE. Might be something, if you're setting up, for instance, a VPN communication, you might actually be setting an L2TP tunnel. And again, really just contingent on your ISP's configuration settings. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave this alone. We could set the MTU. I'm going to set that automatically here. And then we're going to look at the local network. Remember, DHCP, this is something that maybe you want to allow. A lot of times what you'll have is DHCP might be provided by maybe a server within your network that your clients are communicating to. Maybe you don't want this wireless router, in this case, this router, to be able to send out DHCP leases. If that's the case, you can always disable it. However, you might want to tailor the scope down a little bit. Maybe you don't want 100 users on your network. Maybe you want a little less. Well, that is up to you and how you configure that. Maybe you want to set a static DNS. So we can do that if we need to. So for instance, 8.8, we'll get this 8.8.8, and maybe I want to do maybe an 8.8.4.4, and we can set that. Now, a lot of times what we'll also have too, if we are offering DHCP here, is we might have some printers on our network that maybe we want to set a DHCP reservation that's within this lease process. We can always set the DHCP lease right here. Now, we haven't committed these changes yet, and it's warning me of that, so we'll go ahead and apply those changes. And we'll apply those changes to the router. Keep in mind that sometimes you might see that the router reboots and to actually configure and apply those settings. Sometimes it is really just a soft reset, if you will. It's just the fact that we have to wait in the configuration interface before we can get back to it and continue configuring. Now, the other thing that we might do, now that we've looked at our WAN link, we've looked at DHCP, is there might be a potential that we need something like port forwarding. This isn't uncommon, where you have a communication coming off of the WAN interface and you want it to be directed specifically to an endpoint. And we can do this as well too. And in order to configure port forwarding, let's go here. It's a little different in this interface than you might see, like I've mentioned here. This is actually in security. And while we're here, it gives us a good chance to just take a second and mention things like ensuring that if the router is your firewall, that you're setting up things like stateful packet inspection here. And you can see it's enabled by default too. And you could set some other internet filters here if you needed to, if that was applicable for your environment. Now, in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to go over the apps and gaming section here. And notice that we can set our dynamic DNS if we want, single port forwarding, an entire range, or we can do port triggering. We're going to go ahead and set up a single port forward. Notice that there's nothing really port forwarding rules. We don't have any in here. I'm going to add a single port forwarding rule. We're going to call this remote desktop protocol. And our external port's going to be 3389, internal port 3389, and we'll use both TCP and UDP on this one. It is a TCP protocol, but I'll just keep it at both, and then we're going to define what the endpoint is that we want to verify, that we want to forward that remote desktop protocol traffic to. So in this case, I'm going to use 192.1 or 192.168.1, and then we will forward it to the appropriate IP address, and then we will save this. And now we have a port forwarding rule, and that is ready to go, and we will hopefully be able to forward that traffic as it comes in off the WAN link to the appropriate destination that we see here in the rule, to the appropriate computer within the LAN. and we'll go ahead and choose OK to this. The other thing that you're going to want to do too is that if you do have a new firmware update, you're going to want to go ahead and update the firmware, and there's different ways to do this. Keep in mind that if you are updating the firmware, it's important never to interrupt the firmware, and this could take a while to download the file and then update that firmware, but it is important as well that you are on the latest and greatest firmware when it comes to configuring and installing and configuring your routers within your networks.